Chapter 18 In the Pipeworks. When he got to the Pipeworks, its door stood partly open. Dune stepped inside and was instantly met by the smell of old rubber and mold, so familiar that it swept him backward in time. Everything looked the same as it had when he'd last been here. The slickers hanging on their hooks, the boots tumbled below, and he remembered his first day as a pipeworks laborer, and how determined he had been to discover the secret of the generator and save the city by fixing it. The generator had been past hope by then, on its way to the complete death it was close to now. The way out of Ember had turned out to be very different from what he'd expected. Lighting his way with his own small generator, he started down the long stairway that led to the underground river. Even with the light from the bulb, the narrow steps were hard to see, and he had to go slowly and place his feet with care so as not to slip. He couldn't help thinking, with a shudder, of the people who had died here. He was actually grateful that Trog had cleaned them up. It would have been dreadful to come upon them himself. It seemed a long time before he came out on the walkway beside the river. But when at last he did, the river's sound was the same as always, a thundering churning as the water rushed between the stone banks, rising from the north end of the pipeworks and streaming away through the great mouth-like opening at the south end. The hole he and Lena had sped through on their little boat. Dune paused by the river and tried to bring up the map of the pipeworks in his mind. He needed to picture the way to get through the maze of tunnels to that room where he'd found the mayor asleep amid the piles and piles of things he had stolen from the people of Ember. But the Pipeworks was a different place now. The roar of the unseeable river, and the sense of an endless emptiness in the twisting passageways. This was no longer the busy hive of activity it had been when he worked here. No human presence remained, except perhaps for the ghosts of those who'd been lost in the tunnels long ago, or drowned in the river during the mad rush from the city. He took the third tunnel to the left off the main path by the river. Now, Dune told himself, I need the fourth opening in the right-hand wall. He made his way along. His generator made a bright circle, lighting the front of his jacket and the tops of his shoes, and the walls to either side of him. But he couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, which threw off his sense of distance. The pipes that ran along the walls and ceiling were now, after 9 months of neglect, in even worse shape than they had been. Water seeped down the walls and dripped from the ceiling. Every so often his feet plunged into a puddle, and the water splashed up onto his legs. He began to feel unsure if he'd passed 2 tunnel entrances or 3. He couldn't get a sense of the length of the passage he was in and how far he'd gone. When he came to what he thought was the 4th opening, he hesitated. What if he'd taken a wrong turn, or missed an opening without realizing it? But his memory had not failed him. Minutes later he went around a curve, and there it was, the tunnel that had been roped off when he first came across it. The rope was still there, but now one end of it was loose and lay on the ground, and when he went down the passage he found that the door at the end stood open. He stepped inside, and smiled. He had meant to leave the Pipeworks after checking the mayor's room, but just as he came to the main pathway beside the river, the city took another of its shuddering breaths. Dune heard the grinding and squealing of the ancient generator as its wheels and cranks started up, and overhead the lights blinked and came on. For a moment everything looked as it used to. The main tunnel stretched in both directions, with the dark hollows of the smaller tunnels along it. On the rippling, rushing surface of the water, splinters of light glinted like darting fish. Dune stood on the riverbank, looking, remembering, and thinking. He came to a decision he knew was right. Quickly, before the lights could fade again, he ran along the riverwalk to the generator room. The one time he'd been in here before, the noise and confusion had been so overwhelming that he'd stayed only a few moments. Now he wasted no time gazing at the monstrous old machine. The first thing he did was kick through the litter of rusty old parts and abandoned tools lying on the floor until he found a screwdriver, which he thrust into his pocket. Then he set down his own small generator and made right for the place where an arm of the great machine plunged into the river. He had to crawl on his knees into a narrow space between the whirring gears and the edge of the riverbank to get at it. A stout pipe, mottled with scum and rust, emerged from the generator's side, made a right-angled turn, and went straight down into the water. Where it entered, Dune could see something vast and dark and iron-looking under the surface, turning in halting jolts. It was the wheel that somehow caused the generator to create electricity. He would have to break off that pipe to disconnect the power of the river from the machine. He darted back to where the tools lay scattered and found a wrench that would do. Using his old Pipeworks skills, which came back to him readily, he tightened the wrench around the joint of the connecting pipe and hauled at it as hard as he could. He nearly fell backward into the river. The pipe was so old and rotten that it came apart, crumbling into rough-edged flakes, and right away the gears of the generator slowed and the light began to fade. In a moment, Dune stood in total darkness. The only sound was the rush of the river. No more water would be pumped up into the city, and the lights were gone for good. Before too long, the trogs would have to leave, which was as it should be. They didn't belong in Ember. And yet Dune felt a swell of sorrow. He had killed his city. He felt the pain of it right in the center of himself, as if someone he loved had died. It was true, he thought. He had loved Ember, with all its problems. But Ember's time was over. Now he faced a dilemma. The trogs were waiting for him by the exit path, determined not to let him get out and spread the word about their private underground kingdom. He wouldn't be able to get past them without being seen. Even if he did, he couldn't go up without a light, and they'd see the light. He had to keep them from following him. And he was pretty sure he knew how to do it. He groped his way across the generator room, found his own generator by the door, and cranked its handle. By its light, he made his way back down the riverside path and started up the stairway. When he was nearly to the top, he took a fresh candle from his pack, lit it, and dripped some of its wax onto the step. He stuck the candle in the melted wax, sat down on the step next to it, and took the screwdriver from his pocket. By the candle's light, he undid the ankle cuffs that Trog had fastened onto him. He gave his legs a quick rub. It felt great not to have the metal banging his bones and chafing his skin. Then he left the candle there, it would burn for an hour, and climbed the rest of the stairs. When he reached the locker room, he propped the door to the stairway open with a heavy bucket. He darted into the Pipeworks office and grabbed a key from a ring on the wall. Back in the locker room, he picked up a toolbox, the kind he used to use when he worked here, full of wrenches and hammers. He stepped outside onto the street and used the toolbox to prop the street door open, too. Now came the tricky part. Cranking his generator just enough to light a few steps ahead, he made his way across Plummer Square to Livery Street. This would lead him to the area where the trogs were lying in wait, though he couldn't know exactly where they were. He stopped and stood still, listening. He heard no voices, no footsteps. With his hand against the wall, he crept farther along. He had to be close to Blot Street now. This was far enough. He might run into one of them at any moment. Dune took a quick breath. Here goes, he thought. He began to make the sound of running. He slapped his feet on the pavement, though he was not actually running, but staying just where he was. He panted loudly. "I hear him!" shouted Yorick from out of the darkness. "He's over there!" shouted Kanza. "Get him!" roared Trog. Dune gave a good, loud yelp of fright. A few blocks ahead, he saw one of the trogs, he couldn't tell which, come out of a doorway. He whirled around and ran, cranking his generator every few steps to keep his light going dimly, and when he got back to the Pipeworks door, he snatched up the toolbox and dumped its contents onto the street. The tools clanked and clattered. He kicked most of them aside, as if hastily trying to hide them. Then, leaving the Pipeworks door open and giving the key a quick twist in the knob, he dashed back across the street and crept partway up the stairs beside a shop. He sat there, utterly still. "The noise came from this way!" shouted the voice of Yorick. "Come on, all you slowpokes! Faster!" That was Trog. Dune heard shoes slapping the pavement, and around the corner came the 4 headlights of the trogs, jogging through the darkness. "Here!" yelled Yorick, tripping over the scattered tools. "He dropped his weapons!" "Wait, Noodlehead!" cried Trog. "It's a trick! He wants us to think he's in there, and he's not!" But Yorick had already dashed inside. "Wrong, Pa!" he shouted. "I see his light! He's on his way down those stairs!" At that, the whole family rushed inside, Kanza yelling in glee, Minnie scuttling along last. Dune, quick and silent, crossed the street and closed the Pipeworks door behind them. He had, of course, used the key to set the knob in the locked position. By the time the trogs broke down the door to get out, there were plenty of hammers and wrenches in there to attack it with, but it should still take them at least an hour. He would be a good way up the path, out of their reach. He made for Deeple Street. At the edge of the unknown regions, he exchanged his generator for a candle, which he fitted into his light cap. Several minutes of fast walking brought him to the chasm, which he crossed with quick, careful steps, keeping his mind blank. On the other side, he gave the boards of the bridge a push, so that they fell into the pit. Trog could jump the pit, he knew, but still this might slow him down a little. Like Lena, Dune noticed the cans and bottles that had been dropped to mark the way to the path. He followed their trail, going as fast as he could and aiming a hard kick at each one as he passed it, sending it skidding off into the darkness. Another way to slow Trog down. When he felt fatigue creeping up on him, he pictured the trogs battering down the Pipeworks door, and that gave him the strength to keep going. The climb up the path was arduous and long. He burned one candle after another on the way, but no one pursued him, as far as he could tell. He got safely to the top and edged through the crack to the outside. It was dark, but he could tell from the faintness of the stars that the day was near. He needed to rest, even for just a few minutes, before he could go. But first he had to look at what Skago had given him. He took off his pack and felt inside for the bundle, pulled it out. He took off his pack, felt inside it for the bundle, pulled it out, and unwound the yellow cloth. There was the diamond, glimmering in the dim light that was not yet dawn. He ran his hand over its glassy surface. He turned it upside down and saw the twists and turns and tabs of metal within its circular collar. He didn't really know what this diamond was any more than Trog did, and there was no time to examine it now, but he was sure that he could find out. He felt grateful to Skago for giving it to him, even a bit grateful to Trog for finding it in the first place. The diamond was meant to be his. Through these unlikely people, it had come to him after all.